Hello and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if you enjoy it, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support means a lot and helps me bring you more bedtime stories filled with mystery, atmosphere, and suspense. Now, let's begin with our story for tonight. The forgotten letter found in a Boston apartment. It was a gray and rainy afternoon in March 2019 when Sarah Whitmore, a British teacher who had recently moved to Boston for a 2-year exchange program, first set foot inside her rented apartment on Beacon Hill. The building itself was old, with red brick walls that had survived more than a century of harsh winters and humid summers. Its narrow staircase creaked beneath her steps, and every corner carried a faint scent of dust mixed with something metallic, as if the very air held fragments of the past. Sarah had left London with the hope of a fresh start. She was 32, independent, and eager for change after the quiet unraveling of a long relationship back home. Teaching at the Boston Latin School seemed like the perfect chance to rediscover herself in a city brimming with history. As she carried her final box into the dimly lit flat, the sound of rain pattering against a window seemed almost rhythmic, as though welcoming her in. The apartment was small but had character. High ceilings, uneven wooden floors, and a fireplace that had long since been sealed. She lit a small lamp, its glow chasing away the shadows, and began unpacking. It was when she pushed aside an old dresser left by the previous tenant that she noticed it. A thin crack in the wall, barely visible, but wide enough to hide something. Curious, she reached inside and her fingers touched paper, fragile and cold. Slowly, she pulled out an envelope, yellow with age, its edges brittle and curled. The name on the front made her breath catch. Eleanor Whitmore, December 1942. The surname was her own. Coincidence? Or something more? Sarah sat down on the wooden floor, the envelope trembling slightly in her hand. She studied the handwriting, elegant and sweeping, the kind one rarely saw anymore. The ink had faded, yet the letters carried a weight that demanded attention. She hesitated before opening it, almost as if breaking the seal might disturb a secret meant to remain untouched. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the glass. The street lamps flickered to life one by one, casting a golden hue across the wet cobblestones below. Finally, she slipped her finger beneath the flap and opened the letter. The paper inside was delicate, and she unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The words inside were addressed to someone named Thomas. My dearest Thomas, the days grow longer without your return, and though the war rages on across the sea, I cling to the hope that you will walk through the door again. Boston feels emptier without you. Every corner of the city reminds me of our walks, our laughter, and the promises we made. If fate is cruel and you cannot return, know that my heart will remain yours, always. Eleanor. Sarah read it twice, her chest tightening with a strange mix of sorrow and fascination. She thought about the date, December 1942. In England, the Blitz had scarred cities, while in America soldiers were being sent overseas. Eleanor's Thomas must have been one of them, but the question lingered. Why had the letter never been sent? And why had it been hidden behind the wall of her apartment, waiting decades for her, another Whitmore, to discover it? She folded it gently and placed it back in its envelope, though her mind refused to rest. Was Eleanor a distant relative? Did her family unknowingly share a connection with this very building in Boston? The rain outside softened, but the air inside the apartment grew heavier, as if the letter itself had awakened something long dormant. That night, Sarah found it difficult to sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city. Her thoughts circled endlessly around Eleanor, Thomas, and a letter that had somehow found its way into her hands across 77 years of silence. And then, just as she began to drift into uneasy dreams, she thought she heard it. Faint footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment door, followed by the sound of someone pausing, listening, waiting. Sarah froze with her ear against the door, the faint whisper still hanging in the air like smoke. The rational part of her mind begged her to dismiss it. Old buildings creaked, pipes moaned, neighbors muttered in passing. But she could not ignore how clearly it had sounded. It was her name, spoken softly, intimately, as if by someone who knew her well. She stepped back from the door and switched on the lamp. The golden glow pushed away some of the shadows, but could not quiet the rising unease in her chest. The letter lay in its place on the desk. For a moment she considered sliding it back into the crack in the wall, where she had found it, burying it again, pretending none of this had happened. Yet something inside resisted that thought. She had been chosen to find it, she told herself. To turn away now would feel like betrayal. The following day, she met Michael again. They walked together along the Charles River, the breeze carrying the sharp scent of salt from the harbor. He told her what little he knew of Thomas, how he had been last stationed in North Africa, how the family had received only a vague notice of his disappearance in 1943. Nothing more. My father used to say it haunted my grandmother, Michael explained. The not knowing. A grave can bring closure, but silence stretches across generations. Sarah listened, the envelope clutched tightly in her coat pocket. She could see in his eyes that the letter was more than history to him. It was proof that Eleanor's love had been real, that she had waited faithfully. They decided to search together. Michael contacted a cousin in England who had traced parts of the family tree, while Sarah returned to the Boston Public Library, this time focusing on military records. The work was slow, buried beneath microfilm and fragile pages, but each small discovery lit a spark of hope. One evening, she found mention of a Thomas Callahan in a 1943 dispatch printed in a local paper. His unit had been ambushed near Tunisia. Some were killed, others taken prisoner. The article offered no clarity, but opened a path. That night, Sarah dreamed again of Eleanor. This time, Eleanor sat at the old desk in the apartment, pen in hand, writing by lamplight. She looked up at Sarah, her eyes wet but determined, and whispered again, "Find him." Her voice was clearer, urgent, almost pleading. Sarah jolted awake, her heart pounding. She looked around the apartment half, expecting to see Eleanor still sitting there. The room was empty, yet the air carried the faintest trace of perfume, something floral and old-fashioned. She could not ignore it any longer, whether it was her imagination or something beyond. Eleanor was guiding her. The next weekend, Michael visited the apartment. He walked the room slowly, touching the walls, the worn floorboards, as if trying to sense the past within them. When Sarah showed him the crack in the wall, he grew quiet, staring at it for a long time. "My grandmother always said Eleanor vanished," he murmured, "but maybe she never really left." They sat at the small kitchen table, the letter between them. Outside, the city moved on with its modern pace, but inside the apartment the atmosphere thickened, heavy with history. Michael traced the handwriting with his finger, his expression troubled. There might be military archives in Washington that hold more, he said finally. If Thomas was taken prisoner, records could still exist. It would take digging, maybe even traveling. Sarah nodded. The thought of pursuing the truth beyond Boston both frightened and exhilarated her. This was no longer just a curiosity she had stumbled into. It had become a calling. That night, after Michael left, Sarah lingered by the window. Beacon Hill glowed in the soft light of the street lamps, the cobblestones glistening faintly after an earlier drizzle. She thought of Eleanor gazing out at the same view, waiting for Thomas, year after year. As midnight approached, the footsteps returned in the hallway, steadier this time, slower, as if whoever walked wanted her to notice. Sarah's pulse raced. She stepped to the door, her hand hovering over the knob. Then came the whisper again, not just her name, but phrase breathy and low. "He waits." Sarah's hand trembled. She turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The air, however, carried a chill that raised goosebumps along her arms. And at her feet, just inside the doorway, lay something small and metallic. An old soldier's button, dull by time, its brass surface scratched but unmistakable. Sarah bent down and picked it up, her heart hammering. She turned it over her hand, the weight of it undeniable. It had not been there before. She stepped back inside and closed the door, locking it firmly. The letter and the button now sat side by side on her desk, silent companions from a story that refused to stay buried. She understood then. This was only the beginning. Sarah placed a button next to the letter and sat in silence for a long while. The apartment felt different now, as though unseen eyes were upon her. Every creak of the old wooden floor seemed amplified. Every sigh of wind outside seemed to carry a hidden message. She touched the button again. Its surface was rough, worn, but real. She could not deny what she had found. The apartment was speaking to her in its own way, through Eleanor, through Thomas, through these fragments of the past that kept surfacing. The following morning she walked through Beacon Hill with her senses sharpened. She noticed the uneven bricks of the buildings, the wrought iron railings, the lamps that leaned slightly from age. History was not in books alone. It lived in these stones, in these narrow streets where generations had walked and loved and suffered. She thought of Eleanor waiting at her window, her heart tethered to a man across an ocean, and the weight of that longing pressed itself upon Sarah's chest. At school, her students noticed her distraction. She found herself staring at the clock, impatient for the day to end so she could return to her search. When the final bell rang, she hurried once more to the library, diving back into the archives with a kind of fever. She traced shipping lists, draft records, casualty reports. The name Thomas Callahan appeared again and again, but never with clarity, always shrouded in the fog of war. Michael joined her in these searches. He carried a calm persistence, as though he had spent his whole life preparing for this moment. They spent evenings poring over documents, sometimes in silence, sometimes in bursts of excitement when a small discovery was made. The bond between them grew, forged not only by the mystery, but by the sense that together they were shouldering the weight of someone else's unfinished story. Weeks passed. The dreams returned. Eleanor came to Sarah again and again, each time clearer. Sometimes she was writing, sometimes staring from the window, sometimes crying silently as she held Thomas's photograph. One night she placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder in the dream and whispered, "He did not die there." The words woke Sarah with a jolt. Her body shook, but her heart burned with determination. Michael believed her when she told him. He did not laugh or doubt. Instead, he looked at her with solemn eyes and said, "Then we keep going until we know." Their search led them beyond Boston. Michael arranged a visit to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They traveled by train, the rhythmic motion giving Sarah time to think. She gazed out at the passing countryside, its fields washed in early summer light, and wondered how many soldiers had once left their homes with promises of return, only to vanish into history. The archives building loomed large and imposing. Inside, the air was cool, the silence heavy. They requested records, signed forms, and waited with nervous anticipation as boxes were brought to their table. Inside were files brittle with age, stamped with dates and official seals. Sarah's hands trembled as she leafed through them. At last they found mention of Private Thomas R. Callahan, captured near Tunisia in early 1943, transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Italy. There the trail grew faint, but not lost. Another document suggested he had been moved again as the Allies advanced, possibly toward Germany. No record of his death. No confirmation of his survival. Only questions layered upon questions. Michael pressed his forehead into his hands. Overcome. All these years, he whispered, and still nothing certain. Sarah placed her hand over his. But it means Eleanor was right, she said softly. He did not die there. She must have known. That night in their hotel, Sarah dreamed once more. She saw Eleanor at a train platform, waving desperately, her eyes full of both hope and terror. Behind her stood soldiers, shadows stretching long. She turned to Sarah and said, "Find the last place." He waited there. Sarah awoke with the echo of the words in her ears. The last place. The words gnawed at her. Over the next weeks they searched further, reaching out to historians, veterans associations, anyone who might know about prisoner transfers during the war. Each clue pulled them deeper. Sarah found herself awake late at night, writing down dates, sketching maps, piecing together movements. The apartment became her workshop. Papers strewn across the table, the letter and button always at the center, as though they anchored everything. The strange occurrences in the apartment did not stop. Sometimes she heard footsteps at night, sometimes a soft knock on the wall, sometimes the faintest strains of music from another era, fading when she tried to listen closely. Once she woke to find the button had moved from the desk to the window ledge, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She whispered Eleanor's name, and for a moment she thought she felt a presence, gentle but firm, urging her forward. Her bond with Michael deepened too. They spoke not only of the search, but of their own lives, their own losses. For Sarah, the failed relationship in London seemed distant now, as though she had shed it with her old skin. For Michael, the mystery of his grandfather had long been a wound, and with Sarah's help he felt it beginning to heal, even if answers still eluded them. Summer turned to autumn. The streets of Boston filled with golden leaves, and the nights grew sharper. One evening, Michael brought an old photograph his cousin had found in an attic trunk. It showed Thomas in uniform, standing beside a young woman who could only be Eleanor. Her eyes, though smiling, carried the same depth of sorrow Sarah had seen in dreams. Holding the photograph, Sarah felt a surge of connection. This was a woman who had haunted her nights, whose voice whispered still. She pressed the photo to her chest and whispered, "We're trying. We'll find him." The next night the dream changed. She saw a camp, barbed wire under gray sky. Men in tattered uniforms lined up. Among them, Thomas, older, thinner, but alive. He turned as if sensing her, and his lips formed the words, "Tell her." Sarah awoke trembling. Tears wet on her cheeks. She called Michael at once, her voice shaking as she told him. He listened in silence, then said, "We have to go to Europe. The records there might hold what we need." It was a daunting idea, but Sarah felt it was inevitable. The story would not let her go. She was part of it now, whether she had chosen or not. Together, they planned a journey. Archives in Italy, in Germany, perhaps even England. Each step forward felt guided by unseen hands, by Eleanor's whispers, by Thomas's plea. The night before they were to leave, Sarah sat alone in the apartment, the letter and button before her. The air grew still, and she felt a presence settle around her like a shawl. She closed her eyes and spoke aloud. "We're going. We'll find him. I promise." When she opened her eyes again, the envelope lay slightly open on the desk, and within it, where before there had only been a folded letter, now rested a pressed flower, brown with age but still holding the faint outline of its petals. Sarah touched it gently, her breath catching. A flower from Eleanor's time, carried across decades, waiting to be found. A sign. She felt certain that she was on the right path. The city outside hummed with life, modern and oblivious. But inside the apartment, past and present breath together. The journey was not finished. The story was still unfolding, and Sarah, though trembling, felt ready to follow it wherever it would lead. The pressed flower lay fragile in Sarah's palm, its once vibrant petals now faded into shades of brown and cream, yet its presence felt more alive than anything else in the apartment. She turned it carefully under the lamplight, as if afraid her touch alone might turn it into dust. How could it appear now, after decades sealed away in the envelope? She whispered Eleanor's name again, and for the briefest moment she thought she felt the brush of air against her cheek, like a hand stroking gently. The next morning, Boston awoke under a pale sky streaked with clouds. Sarah met Michael at South Station, their luggage at their feet, both carrying the quiet weight of expectation. They were heading first to Italy, then on to Germany, chasing the trail of Thomas's captivity. Sarah carried the envelope and its contents carefully in a hard case, as though she were protecting something sacred. The flight was long, yet Sarah found little rest. Each time she drifted toward sleep, she heard faint whispers in her dreams, words half-formed, names, places. Sometimes she saw Eleanor's face, sometimes Thomas's, both urging her on. When they finally landed in Rome, the heavy Mediterranean heat wrapped around them, so different from the crisp Boston air. Their first stop was the Italian archives in Bologna, where wartime records of prisoners were kept. The building was vast, its corridors echoing with footsteps. Michael spoke fluent Italian, which helped them navigate the bureaucracy. After hours of waiting and signing documents, they were handed files bound with twine, the paper yellow and brittle. There was again Thomas R. Callahan, prisoner number 427, transferred from Tunisia to a camp outside Medina in March 1943. A note followed, transferred north September 1943. No death recorded, no confirmation of survival, just a trail moving deeper into the chaos of war. Michael sat back in his chair, staring at the file. So he lived through the Italian camp, he whispered. Sarah touched the pressed flower, hidden safely in the envelope in her bag, and was taken north, she said softly, toward Germany. That evening, they walked the narrow streets of Bologna, the warm air heavy with the smell of food and wine. Yet neither could eat much. Their minds were trapped in 1943, imagining Thomas among the lines of weary prisoners, walking under guard, not knowing if he would ever see home again. That night in the hotel, Sarah dreamed again. She saw Thomas on a march, thin, exhausted, his eyes still burning with determination. Behind him, Eleanor appeared, walking as if unseen by the guards, her hand hovering close to his shoulder. Then Eleanor turned her head to Sarah and whispered, "Tell him I never stopped." Sarah woke with tears on her face. She sat in the dim hotel room, the sound of distant traffic humming outside, and clutched the letter. It no longer felt like an artifact. It was alive, a conduit pulling her deeper. In the morning, they traveled by train to Munich, then to a smaller town where a former prisoner of war camp had once stood. Now it was a memorial with plaques and exhibits. The silence of the grounds almost unbearable. Sarah walked slowly among the ruins, the gravel crunching under her shoes, her chest tight. She could imagine the men standing here, waiting, hoping. Inside the small museum, they searched through a register of names. And there it was, Callahan Thomas R., listed as transferred from Italy in late 1943. Next to his name was a single notation scrawled in faded ink. Missing January 1945. Michael's breath caught. Missing, he repeated. Not dead. Missing. They stared at the word, both hearts pounding. The war had been nearly over then. Was he lost in the chaos of retreat? Did he escape? The absence of finality was both torment and hope. That night back in Munich, Sarah could not sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the city lights. Suddenly, she smelled it, faint but distinct. A perfume, old, fashioned, floral, drifting through the room though no bottle was near. She turned and saw the envelope lying on the bedside table. The flap lifted slightly as if moved by a breeze, though the window was shut. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. When she opened the paper, the pressed flower seemed fresher somehow, its edges less brittle, as though revived by unseen hands. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered, "Eleanor, we're trying." The next day they took a train north, into Germany's countryside, where rolling fields stretched under pale skies. Their destination was a regional archive near Nuremberg, where final war records were often stored. The town was quiet, cobblestones wet from a light rain. The archive smelled of dust and age, the silence broken only by the turning of pages. In a folder marked 1945, they found something that made Sarah's skin prickle. A report of a group of prisoners who escaped during the final months of the war, names listed, nationalities mixed. Among them, Callahan, T.R. Michael's hand shook as he traced the letters. "He escaped," he whispered. "He got out." But then came the question, what happened after? There was no record of his return to the United States, no obituary, no mention in family records. It was as if he had walked into freedom and then vanished from the world entirely. That night, Sarah dreamed once more. She saw Thomas walking along a forest path, weak but determined, the trees closing around him, snow falling silently. Eleanor appeared at his side again, holding his hand. Then both turned to her, their eyes filled with something she could not name, longing, gratitude, sorrow. Thomas whispered, "Tell her." Sarah woke with the words pounding in her head. Tell her? Tell her what? That he survived? That he loved her until the end? That he tried to come home? Back in Boston weeks later, the apartment felt heavier than before. The button still lay on the desk, the flowers still within the letter. Michael came often, both of them poring over their findings, trying to piece together the puzzle. One evening, as autumn rain lashed against the window, Sarah lit a candle and placed a letter before her. She whispered aloud, "Eleanor, I don't know if Thomas ever made it back, but I promise I'll keep searching. You deserve to know." The flame flickered violently, then steadied. The apartment grew utterly silent. Sarah felt a warmth at her back, as though someone stood behind her, watching. She turned, but the room was empty. Later that night, she dreamed again. Eleanor sat by the fireplace, her hands folded, her eyes wet. She whispered one last phrase before fading. "He waits in the last place." Sarah woke with a shiver. The last place. The phrase had come before, but now it felt final, insistent. She sat at the desk, staring at the letter, the button, the flower. All were clues, pieces of story unfinished. Michael believed the last place might mean somewhere in Europe, perhaps the forest where Thomas had fled, but Sarah wasn't certain. Sometimes she wondered if it meant something more, not a physical place, but a space where time and memory lingered, waiting to be uncovered. The days stretched on, the mystery deepening rather than resolving. Sarah felt herself standing at the edge of two worlds, one alive with the noise of Boston, the other haunted by whispers of 1945. And as the November wind howled outside her apartment, she knew the journey was far from over. Somewhere, in some last place, the truth waited, and with it, the peace Eleanor and Thomas had long been denied. Sarah sat in silence, staring at the brass button resting beside the faded envelope on her desk. Her mind replayed the moment she had found it, lying there on the threshold as if deliberately placed. She turned it between her fingers, the metal cool and slightly rough from years of wear. It bore the insignia of the U.S. Army, worn down but still visible. The discovery unsettled her more than the whispers, more than the footsteps. A sound could be explained away, but an object, tangible and real, was harder to dismiss. That night she barely slept. When her eyes closed, she drifted into half. Dreams where Eleanor's face lingered, pale in the flickering lamplight, lips moving as if repeating the same phrase. He waits. When she finally rose with the pale light of dawn, the button remained in its place on the desk, as if waiting for her to act. The following day, Sarah decided to take both the letter and the button to Michael. She needed him to see them together. They met again at a small cafe near Harvard Square, its windows fogged against the October chill. Michael leaned in over the table as she laid the two objects down carefully. His expression shifted slowly from curiosity to astonishment. This is from a uniform," he murmured, lifting the button. "My great-uncle Thomas would have worn something exactly like this." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the same unease she felt. "Where did you find it?" She hesitated. "It was just there, by the door, after the footsteps came again." Michael frowned, but he did not laugh or dismiss her. Instead, he studied the button as though it were a fragile relic unearthed from a battlefield. "Then Eleanor isn't the only one speaking through this place," he said quietly. Over the following weeks, their search deepened. Michael managed to gain access to some military documents through a historian he knew in London. The records confirmed what Sarah had already uncovered, that Thomas Callahan's unit had been ambushed in Tunisia, and several men were reported missing. But then, tucked away in a forgotten file, there appeared a prisoner transfer list. The name Callahan was there, faintly typed, noting his relocation to a camp in Sicily. Michael's hands trembled as he read it. "So he wasn't killed right away," he whispered. "He was alive, at least for a while." For Sarah, this discovery only deepened the mystery. If Thomas had survived long enough to be taken prisoner, what had happened to him afterward? Why had Eleanor never learned the truth? That evening, back in her apartment, Sarah lit a single candle and placed it beside the letter and the button. The flame flickered in the draft, casting shadows that danced across the old wallpaper. She closed her eyes and spoke aloud, though she felt a little foolish. "Eleanor," she said softly, "we found him, at least part of him. He was taken prisoner. Is this what you wanted us to know?" The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. The air seemed charged, like the tense stillness before a storm. Then the faintest sound reached her ears, a woman's sigh, long and sorrowful, echoing through the walls. Sarah's skin prickled, yet she felt no fear. Instead, she felt pity. Eleanor had waited all her life for an answer, and now, through Sarah, fragments of that answer were finally coming to light. Days passed, and Sarah and Michael continued to piece together Thomas's fate. Michael traveled briefly to Washington to access further records, while Sarah remained in Boston, combing through archives at the library. Every discovery led them deeper into the past, but also closer together. They spoke late into the night, sometimes about Eleanor and Thomas, sometimes about themselves. Michael confessed how he often felt like a man without roots, drifting between jobs, never sure where he belonged. Sarah admitted that she, too, had been searching, not just for a place to live, but for meaning in her life beyond work. One cold evening, after a long day of research, Michael returned to the apartment with a folder of photocopied documents. They spread the papers across the table, tracing the path of Thomas's movements. One file hinted at a prisoner transport that never reached its destination, the men presumed lost at sea. Michael clenched his jaw, tears brimming in his eyes. "So that's it?" he asked bitterly. "He drowned somewhere out there, nameless, forgotten?" Sarah placed her hand on his. "Not forgotten," she whispered. "You remembered. Eleanor remembered. And now so do I." As she spoke, The candle flame on the desk flared suddenly, as if in response. Both of them turned toward it, hearts racing. The letter shifted slightly, though no breeze stirred the room. Michael exhaled shakily. "She's here, isn't she?" Sarah nodded. The atmosphere was undeniable. That night, they left the candle burning as they sat in the quiet apartment, listening. At one point, Sarah thought she heard faint music, a wartime tune, something distant and scratchy like an old gramophone playing in another room. Michael swore he smelled lavender, the perfume his grandmother used to describe when speaking of Eleanor. Neither could explain these sensations, yet neither wished to. The haunting was no longer frightening. It felt like guidance, like Eleanor's spirit urging him onward, unwilling to let her story dissolve into dust. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived in Boston, snow dusting the rooftops of Beacon Hill. Sarah and Michael traveled together to London, visiting the archives there. They stood in the hushed halls of the Imperial War Museum, studying records, photographs, faded letters from soldiers who had shared Thomas's fate. One afternoon, in a quiet corner of the archive, Michael discovered a letter from another prisoner of war, a man who had survived. In the letter, he mentioned a soldier named Callahan, brave, kind, always speaking of the woman he loved back in America. The survivor recalled how Callahan had kept a small photograph of her tucked inside his uniform. Michael read the words aloud, his voice breaking. He never stopped thinking of her, he said, even in the darkest place. He carried her with him. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She imagined Eleanor sitting in the Boston apartment, writing those letters, never knowing that across the ocean Thomas was clinging to her memory for strength. When they returned to Boston, Sarah placed a new letter beside Eleanor's, laying them together on the desk as if reuniting two fragments of a broken whole. For the first time since she had moved in, the apartment felt warm, as though the walls themselves exhaled relief. That night, the footsteps came once more, but instead of stopping outside her door, they moved gently down the hallway, growing fainter, until they vanished altogether. Sarah listened, tears filling her eyes. She knew, deep down, that Eleanor had finally found peace. Yet something lingered. The whispers had ceased, the shadows softened, but the button remained. It lay on her desk still, solid and weighty, as if it carried a final piece of the story yet to be told. Sarah could not shake the feeling that Thomas himself was waiting. Not Eleanor now, but the man who had vanished into the chaos of war. Michael noticed it too. "We've given her peace," he said one evening. "But what about him? Where's his rest?" Sarah turned the button in her hand once more, the brass glinting faintly in the lamplight. "Maybe," she said, "he's still waiting to be found." The thought filled her with both dread and determination. If Eleanor's spirit had guided them this far, perhaps Thomas's story was not yet finished. Perhaps the sea had not claimed him after all. Or perhaps, even in death, he waited for someone to acknowledge the truth of his final moments. As the snow thickened outside and the city grew hushed beneath winter's blanket, Sarah resolved that the search was far from over. The forgotten letter had opened a door, not just into the past, but into a mystery that spanned both life and death. And now, standing at its threshold, she knew she could not turn back. The button was still warm in her hand, as if pulsing faintly, like the beat of a heart. The button remained on Sarah's desk for days, untouched except for the moments when she would pick it up absent-mindedly, feeling its weight in her palm. It was almost as though it demanded her attention. Sometimes, late at night when the apartment was silent and the wind hissed faintly through the cracks of the old windows, she swore she could feel a pulse within the metal, steady and faint, like the echo of a heartbeat. Michael noticed it too, during one of his visits. He lifted the button carefully and turned it between his fingers. "It doesn't feel like an object," he said in a low voice. "It feels like a message, as though Thomas himself left it here for us to find." Sarah said nothing, though she knew he was right. The footsteps, the whispers, the sudden shift in the atmosphere of the apartment, all of it had pointed them to Eleanor. And yet now, with Eleanor's side fading into peace, the button remained stubbornly unyielding, like a question that refused to be silenced. Over the next weeks, Boston was wrapped in the stillness of winter. Snow piled along the brick sidewalks of Beacon Hill, the gas lamps casting warm halos of light over the narrow streets. Sarah and Michael spent countless evenings together at the long oak table in the library, poring over microfilm reels, old naval records, and faded photographs of convoys lost at sea. They uncovered reports of prisoner ships transferring soldiers from Sicily to mainland Italy. One such vessel, the Santa Lucia, had vanished during a storm in early 1944. Its wreck never recovered. The manifest was incomplete, but rumors suggested that men from Thomas's unit had been on board. Michael traced the report with his finger, his face pale beneath the harsh library lights. "If he was there," he murmured, "then he didn't just vanish. He drowned. Alone, lost to the ocean." Sarah placed her hand gently over his. "Not alone," she said softly. "He carried Eleanor with him. Every breath, every step, every way that struck him, she was there." Michael closed his eyes, the weight of generations pressing down on him. For Sarah, the moment was heavier still. She had not known Thomas or Eleanor, yet their story had woven itself into her life, binding her fate to theirs. That night, back in the apartment, Sarah dreamed again. This time, the dream was different. She stood not in the apartment, but on the deck of a ship rocked by waves. The wind howled around her, tearing at her hair, and in the darkness she saw men crowded together, thin and weary, their faces hollow from hunger and fear. Among them was Thomas. He was young, far younger than she had expected, his eyes still bright despite the exhaustion. He clutched something close to his chest, and as Sarah moved nearer, she saw it was the very same letter Eleanor had written, worn and creased, but carefully guarded. He turned toward her, though she knew she was invisible, only a witness to a memory. His lips moved, forming words she could not hear over the roar of the sea. Then the ship lurched violently, and the vision shattered. Sarah woke with a cry, the sheets twisted around her body, her heart hammering. And on the desk, she saw the candle she had left unlit had somehow sparked to life. A tiny flame burned steadily beside the button, though no match had touched it. Michael arrived the next morning to find Sarah pale and shaken. She told him about the dream, about the ship, about Thomas clutching the letter. His expression hardened with a mixture of grief and resolve. "We need to go there," he said simply. "Go where?" "To the sea. To Italy. If the Santa Lucia sank, maybe there's a record, a memorial, something left behind. He's asking to be found, Sarah, just as Eleanor asked. We can't stop now." The decision was not made lightly, but within a month they had arranged a trip. They flew first to Rome, then took a train south along the coast, the Mediterranean stretching endlessly to their right, glittering under the pale winter sun. The air was heavy with salt, the cries of gulls echoing above. For Sarah, it felt as though each mile brought them closer not only to Thomas, but to the truth that lay hidden beneath the waves. In a small coastal village near Naples, they found a memorial dedicated to those lost at sea during the war. Names were etched into a wall of stone, hundreds upon hundreds of them, most unfamiliar. But their half, erased by time and salt, was one that made Michael's breath catch. Thomas Callahan. Michael reached out, tracing the carved letters with trembling fingers. "He's here," he whispered. "He's finally here." Sarah felt the air shift around them, as if a presence had drawn close. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she imagined Eleanor standing beside Michael, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The weight of decades lifted, not entirely, but enough for them to feel a strange sense of release. That night, they stayed in a modest inn overlooking the sea. The waves rolled ceaselessly against the rocks below, a lullaby and a requiem all at once. Sarah sat by the window long after Michael had fallen asleep, the brass button warm in her palm. The sea, she realized, did not merely take. It also kept, and perhaps in its depths, Thomas's story still lingered, waiting to be remembered. When she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed once more. This time, Thomas stood at the water's edge, no longer hollowed by hunger or fear. His uniform was whole, his eyes steady, the letter still in his hand. He looked directly at her, his lips forming words she could finally hear. "Tell her I waited." Sarah woke with tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew then what she must do. When they returned to Boston weeks later, the apartment no longer felt haunted. The whispers had faded, the footsteps gone. Yet one final task remained. Sarah placed the brass button and the letter in a small wooden box and carried it with Michael to Mount Auburn Cemetery, where Eleanor had been buried decade before. Together, they set the box gently into the earth at the foot of her grave. Michael's voice shook as he spoke. Now they can rest. Together, the wind stirred softly through the bare branches, carrying with it the faintest trace of lavender. Sarah felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing, only the quiet peace of the cemetery, and the sense that for the first time in many years, both Eleanor and Thomas were no longer waiting. Yet, as Sarah walked back toward the gates, she could not shake the feeling that the story was not truly finished. The dreams might fade, the whispers might fall silent, but the button had left its mark on her life. It was as though the past had chosen her. And now, somewhere out there, other forgotten letters, other restless spirits, might be waiting for someone willing to listen. For now, the apartment on Beacon Hill was still and calm. But Sarah knew silence was never final. The winter in Boston gradually loosened its grip. Snow melted into rivulets that traced down the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, and the air grew damp with the first hints of spring. Sarah had returned from Italy with Michael weeks before, and for a time there was peace. The apartment felt lighter, less burdened. The whispers that had haunted her sleep no longer stirred in the night, yet silence itself began to feel uncanny. She had grown used to the presence, to the sighs in the dark, to the sense of not being alone. One evening in late March, Sarah stood by the window, watching the rain wash down the narrow street below. The gas lamp shimmered in the puddles, and somewhere distant a piano played through an open window. She was holding a book when she noticed something odd tucked between the pages. Where she swore she had never placed it was a slip of yellowed paper. She unfolded it cautiously, her pulse quickening. The handwriting was different from Eleanor's, sharper, heavier, almost urgent. It read, "They did not all go down with the sea. Seek further and you will see." Sarah's hand trembled. She whispered aloud, as if speaking to the empty room, "Thomas, is it you?" The candle on her desk flickered violently, though the window was closed. The following morning she called Michael, her voice hushed though she was alone. He came that afternoon, rain dripping from his coat as he entered the apartment. She showed him the slip of paper, and he stared at it for a long time before speaking. "If this is real," he said, "then Thomas might not have drowned after all. What if he survived the sinking? What if he made it further?" Sarah thought of the dreams she had had, the visions of Thomas on the deck, clutching Eleanor's letter. In her dream, he had not been consumed by the waves. Perhaps the message was right. Perhaps history had hidden him too quickly beneath the sea. Michael reached across the table, his voice low but firm. "If there's even a chance, we have to follow it." And so their search began anew. The next weeks blurred into long hours spent with maps, records, and correspondence. Michael contacted historians in Sicily and Naples, asking if there were reports of prisoners who had escaped transport ships. Sarah delved into naval logs and obscure footnotes in books few had read in decades. Each clue was thin as thread, but together they began weaving a tapestry. One night, Sarah dreamed again. She was walking along a narrow road flanked by olive trees, the air heavy with summer heat. In the distance she saw a man limping, his clothes ragged, his face burned by the sun. It was Thomas. He turned toward her, his lips cracked, and whispered a single word before fading into the haze. South. When she told Michael the next day, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, he spread a map across her kitchen table, tracing his finger down the coast of southern Italy. If he survived the sinking, maybe he made it ashore somewhere near Calabria. Prisoners sometimes escape, try to blend into villages. Sarah shivered, and maybe he never made it back. The thought weighed heavily on both of them. If Thomas had lived beyond the sea, then his fate was even more uncertain. Their investigation eventually led them to an elderly historian in Reggio Calabria. Over crackling of a poor phone connection, he told Michael of local stories, of a foreign soldier who had wandered into a village in 1944, starving in half, mad with fever. The villagers had hidden him for a time, but then the man had vanished, leaving only rumors in his wake. Michael pressed for more, but the historian's memory was faded. His name? Michael asked. The man paused. I cannot say, but he carried a small picture, a woman in a white dress. Some say he kissed it every night. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. It had to be Eleanor. They decided to go. Again they crossed the Atlantic, arriving in Italy in the warmth of early summer. The village lay in hills above the sea, its stone houses clinging to the slope, vines curling along the walls. Time seemed slower there, the air thick with the scent of lemons and the sound of cicadas. They found the church first, its bell tower rising against the sky. Inside, the cool air smelled of wax and stone. Sarah knelt by a side altar, her fingers brushing against the grooves of the marble floor. She felt a sudden chill, as though someone had knelt there before her, praying desperately. An elderly priest approached them, his eyes kind but clouded with age. When Michael explained their search, the priest listened silently before nodding. There was a man, he said softly. I was a boy then, but I remember he stayed in the rectory for a short time. He spoke little, always clutching that photograph. He called her Ellie. Sarah's heart caught in her throat. What happened to him? The priest's gaze lowered. One night he was gone. Some said he tried to cross the mountains. Others whispered he was taken again. His fate was never known. Michael gripped the edge of the pew, his knuckles white. So he might have died here. Alone. Sarah shook her head. Not alone. He had her with him. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, they walked through the narrow lanes of the village. The stones glowed gold in the fading light, and somewhere a woman's voice sang an old lullaby. Sarah felt the weight of history pressing close, yet also a strange sense of companionship. She could almost imagine Thomas walking these same streets, his boots worn, his heart still tethered across the ocean. That night, Sarah dreamed once more. She stood in a field beneath the mountains, the grass waving in the wind. Thomas appeared again, no longer ragged, no longer weary. His uniform was whole, his face calm. He held Eleanor's photograph in one hand, the brass button in the other. He looked at her and spoke clearly, his voice steady. I carried her with me, every step. Tell her I waited. Sarah woke in tears, her heart aching with the weight of his words. She looked across the room where Michael slept, and she knew that the search had changed both of them. They were no longer merely uncovering a forgotten history. They were carrying it forward, giving voice to a man and woman who'd been silenced by time. When they returned to Boston weeks later, Sarah brought with her a small stone from the Calabrian hills. She placed it on her desk beside the button and the letter, a silent reminder of the path Thomas had walked. The apartment was quiet, but not empty. She no longer feared the silence. Instead, she felt watched over, guided. At times, when the candle flickered without cause, she would smile faintly and whisper, "I hear you." Michael visited often. Sometimes they spoke of continuing their research, perhaps writing a book about Thomas and Eleanor. Other times they simply sat together in the quiet, the weight of their shared journey binding them in ways neither had expected. But Sarah knew the story was not finished. The letter had opened a door, the button had carried them further, and now the stone lay waiting. Each object seemed to call to the next, as though the past itself refused to let go until its tale was complete. And so, as spring turned to summer and the city of Boston stirred with life, Sarah found herself wondering what other forgotten voices lingered in the old buildings of Beacon Hill. Perhaps hers was not the only apartment with the past pressed close against the present. Perhaps there were other letters, other whispers, waiting for someone willing to listen. The silence in her apartment deepened that night, but it no longer frightened her. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the weight of history settle around her like a blanket. Somewhere, she thought, Thomas and Eleanor were listening too. The next few days in Boston unfolded with an unusual mix of restlessness and quiet suspense. Daniel carried the folded letter in his satchel everywhere he went, as though it were both a burden and a charm. At work in the library archives, he often caught himself absent-mindedly touching the envelope's brittle edges through the fabric of his bag. His colleagues noticed his distracted air, but none pried, assuming perhaps that he was lost in research or the fog of personal troubles. One evening, after his shift, Daniel walked toward Beacon Hill, where the red brick houses leaned into each other like tired confidants. The autumn air was sharp, scented faintly with roasting chestnuts from a street vendor on the corner. The flickering gas lamps cast long shadows across the cobblestones, reminding him of another era, the very one the letter seemed to belong to. He stopped at a narrow cafe called the Copper Lantern, a quiet place tucked away behind ivy-draped windows. Inside, the low hum of conversation blended with the clinking of cups. He settled at a corner table with a notebook, determined to piece together the fragmented story from the letter. The writing inside still haunted him. The way Eleanor described her waiting, her heartache, her plea for return that never seemed to arrive. Daniel wrote the names again: Eleanor Wickham, Henry Alcott, beneath the glow of a dim wall sconce. He tried to imagine them. Eleanor, perhaps a young woman with auburn hair pinned beneath a hat, her hands ink-stained as she wrote in desperation. Henry, a man caught in duty or distance, perhaps a soldier, perhaps a scholar. That night, as rain pattered against the cafe's windows, Daniel made a decision. He would trace Eleanor, not as a historian chasing facts, but as someone who owed her memory acknowledgement. The search began at the Boston Public Library's genealogy records. He scrolled through microfilms, his eyes growing heavy under the flickering light of the old machine. Hours passed, pages turned, and at last he found something, a small entry in the census record from 1920. Eleanor Wickham, listed at an address not far from where his apartment now stood. Her occupation was marked simply as teacher. Daniel's heart raced. He whispered the name to himself, as if it might answer back. But questions multiplied. Who was Henry? Why had the letter remained unsent or forgotten? The next day, he visited the Boston Athenaeum. The hushed halls and towering shelves felt like a sanctuary for secrets. He combed through old newspapers and finally found mention. Miss Eleanor Wickham to host Literary Circle, Beacon Hill, 1923. It was a small notice, tucked in the corner of the society pages, but it made her feel alive in a way the census record had not. She was not just a teacher, but a woman of words, gathering people around books and conversation. By now, Daniel felt a strange closeness to her, though she had lived a century before. He wondered if Henry had ever attended those gatherings, if he stood at the edge of the parlor with unspoken feelings pressing against his chest. Late at night, the letter still sat unfolded on his desk. His apartment grew silent, save for the creak of old wood and the occasional siren from the street. Sometimes Daniel thought he heard faint echoes, as if voices were caught in the plaster walls. Once, drifting near sleep, he almost imagined a woman's whisper, measured, longing, soft as paper itself. Though when he opened his eyes, only shadows stared back. Determined to follow the trail further, he visited the old Wickham residence, now a weathered townhouse with a green door that seemed to have survived more than its share of storms. The current owner, a kind woman in her 60s named Margaret, allowed him to look around after he explained his research. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and age. In the back parlor, Margaret showed him a set of old photographs she had found tucked into a trunk in the attic. There she was, Eleanor, her eyes sharp, her dress modest but graceful, her expression both proud and quietly wistful. Daniel stared for a long time. He recognized her in some unexplainable way, as though the letter had already etched her image into his mind before he had ever seen her face. Margaret leaned over his shoulder and pointed. That was taken around 1922, if I'm not mistaken. She lived here until, perhaps 1940. After that, I'm not certain. Records are patchy. Daniel asked gently if she had seen any mention of Henry, but Margaret shook her head. No trace, no photograph, no name, only Eleanor, standing alone in faded frames, her smile half-formed as if she were waiting still. That night, as Daniel walked back through the streets, he thought about the silence between names, the space where entire lives vanish. The letter seemed less like an isolated relic and more like an unfinished story begging to be remembered. The following weeks turned into a quiet obsession. Daniel began waking early, combing through archives before work, jotting down timelines, sketching maps of Eleanor's known addresses, tracing the names of her acquaintances. He learned she had once published short essays in a local magazine, the Boston Review of Letters, and he spent hours at the university library searching for brittle copies. In one of the essays, Eleanor wrote about the nature of waiting. She described the city's shifting seasons as metaphors for patience, winter as endurance, spring as hope, autumn as resignation. Her words carried the same timbre as a letter, filled with a yearning that seemed directed at someone just beyond reach. Daniel could not help but believe Henry was a silent recipient of her longing, though perhaps he had never read it. One chilly afternoon, as leaves skittered across the pavement like hurried messengers, Daniel sat in Boston Common. He pulled the letter from his satchel, the edges softer now from being handled so often. He read it aloud quietly, the words carried into the wind. A passerby glanced at him oddly, but he didn't care. He felt as though by reading her words aloud in the open, he was giving them back to the city, returning her voice to the world. But the mystery deepened when, through a friend at the Historical Society, Daniel obtained a copy of a marriage record from 1931. Eleanor Wickham had married a man named Charles Davenport, a merchant from Cambridge. The discovery both startled and saddened him. So she had married after all, though Henry's absence in her life was conspicuous. Had she given up on waiting? Had Henry vanished? Or had something darker intervened? That night, sleep eluded him. He dreamed of Eleanor standing by a window, her hands pressed against the glass, watching someone walk away in a fog she could not penetrate. He woke with the uneasy sense that the letter had not simply been lost. It had been hidden. The question pressed into him relentlessly. Who hid it and why? The following morning dawned pale, with a thin veil of mist clinging to the narrow streets of Boston. Daniel awoke with the uneasy weight of Eleanor's secret pressing against his chest. He brewed a pot of strong black coffee, though it tasted weaker than usual, as though his senses were too wrapped in thought to register flavor. On his desk, the marriage record he had uncovered the night before lay beneath the yellowed letter, the two documents whispering to each other across decades. He couldn't reconcile the two versions of Eleanor in his mind. The woman who wrote with such raw longing to a man named Henry, and the woman who later became Mrs. Charles Davenport Cambridge. Did the letter represent a chapter she closed forever, or was it something more, a silence forced upon her? As Daniel walked to work that day, Beacon Street glistened from an early drizzle. The scent of damp leaves rose from the pavement, mixing with the faint salt the harbor carried inland by the wind. Boston, in all its layers of past and present, seemed to hum with unseen echoes. Every doorway looked like it might conceal an old story. Every shuttered window seemed to hold a watcher from another time. At the library, Daniel arranged his tasks quickly so he could slip into the archive room. He began tracing Charles Davenport. To his surprise, the merchant had been fairly prominent in his community. Newspaper clippings painted him as a man of stability, someone active in trade associations, a benefactor of a local church. Yet there was a sterility in his life's description, a neatness that almost felt too deliberate. Eleanor's fire, her words about longing, her fragile tenderness, felt muted when paired with his name. Daniel began to wonder if Charles had known about Henry. Had he perhaps been the one to find the letter and hide it away in the Boston apartment, where Daniel discovered it decades later? The thought clung to him like smoke. Weeks slipped by, and Daniel's evenings were consumed with this pursuit. He read until his eyes burned, scribbling notes in the margins of his notebooks, his desk littered with clippings and photocopies. The more he dug, the more he felt Eleanor's presence growing in his life. Sometimes, when the wind rattled the windows at night, he thought he could hear her voice, faint but insistent, urging him not to stop. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel boarded a train to Cambridge. He wanted to see where Eleanor had lived after her marriage. The address listed on the old record took him to a quiet residential street lined with tall oaks. The house itself was stately, with white columns and a broad porch that now bore the marks of time. Chipped paint, sagging steps, ivy crawling along the brick. He stood for a long time at the gate, watching the curtains flutter in the windows, imagining Eleanor moving about those rooms in another century. The current occupants, a young couple with children, allowed him to look around after he explained his research interest in the property's past. Inside, he noticed the parlor was still arranged with heavy furniture, as if echoing its original design. The wallpaper had faded, but bore patterns of delicate vines and flowers. Standing there, Daniel felt as though he had stepped into the residue of Eleanor's life. In one upstairs bedroom, now used as a study, he noticed faint initials carved into the wooden frame of the window. E.W. The carving was subtle, almost hidden beneath layers of varnish, but once seen it was undeniable. He touched the grooves gently, imagining Eleanor's hand pressing the knife or needle into the wood, perhaps in a moment of loneliness. On the train ride back, Boston's skyline emerging to the fog, Daniel felt torn between awe and melancholy. Eleanor had indeed lived, loved, and left traces, but Henry remained only a shadow in her story. That evening, he returned to his apartment weary but restless. He opened the letter again, its fragile folds now dangerously close to tearing. His eyes lingered on the final lines, the plea she had written, the hope that Henry might return. Suddenly, he noticed something he hadn't paid enough attention to before. The date. The letter was marked February 1921. With a jolt, Daniel realized this was nearly a decade before Eleanor's marriage to Charles Davenport, which meant that Henry's absence, or fate, might have shaped her decision to move on. If he could learn what happened to Henry around that time, perhaps the story would become clearer. The next day, Daniel immersed himself in military records. He suspected Henry might have served in the First World War, given the timing. After hours of combing through enlistment documents, he found a possibility. Henry Alcott, a private from Massachusetts, who had been stationed in Europe and returned in late 1919. But then the trail grew faint. He pressed further, searching newspapers from the early 1920s. At last, in a small obituary column from March 1921, he found it. Henry Alcott, age 27, of Boston, passed suddenly due to illness, survived by no immediate family. Daniel froze. The date matched too closely to ignore. Henry had died just weeks after Eleanor's letter was written. His heart ached as he imagined her writing those words, waiting for him, never knowing he would never return. He leaned back in his chair, overcome with a heavy stillness. The mystery was solved in part, yet the sadness of it was sharper than he expected. The forgotten letter was not simply unsent. It had become a memorial of unfulfilled hope, buried in the dust of a Boston apartment. For days, Daniel carried this knowledge like a stone in his chest. The city moved on around him, but he found himself walking slower, watching the streets as though they belonged more to Eleanor's time than his own. He visited her photograph again at Margaret's house, and this time, he felt as though he could almost see the weight behind her eyes. But the story didn't end there. For even though Henry was gone, Eleanor had lived nearly 2 more decades in Cambridge, her life shadowed by memories no one else could touch. Daniel wanted to know how she carried on, whether she found happiness with Charles, or whether she remained haunted by the man she lost. One evening, Daniel decided to visit Mount Auburn Cemetery, where many prominent families were buried. He walked among the rows of marble stones, the air crisp with the scent of pine and fallen leaves. At last he found her, Eleanor Wickham Davenport, 1894 to 1941. The stone was modest, engraved with simple words, "Beloved teacher and friend." He stood there for a long time, tracing the letters with his fingers. He left a folded copy of her letter at the base of the stone, though he kept a fragile original in his apartment. It felt like a way of giving her words back to her, as though after all this time, they had finally reached their destination. Yet even as he turned to leave the cemetery, he felt unsettled. There was still the question of how the letter ended up hidden in his apartment. Eleanor had lived elsewhere after her marriage, so why had it been left behind in Boston? Had someone moved it deliberately? Was it possible that Charles discovered it and concealed it, never wanting her longing for Henry to remain in the open? The questions lingered like shadows in the corners of his room at night. Daniel could not shake the sense that the story had not yet finished. One cold evening, as snow began to fall in soft, hesitant flakes across the city, Daniel sat at his desk staring at the pile of research he had collected. A knock sounded at his door. He opened it to find Margaret, the current owner of Eleanor's old home. She smiled faintly, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I was sorting through another trunk," she explained, "and I found this. I thought you should see it." Inside the bundle was a collection of Eleanor's notebooks, their covers worn but intact. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the first one. The pages were filled with her handwriting, poems, reflections, fragments of thought. And there, on one page, a single line stood out. "I waited for you by the window, Henry, long after the lamps had burned out. I still wait, though you never come." Daniel's breath caught. The story, it seemed, was far from finished. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the notebooks Margaret had placed before him. The snow outside was falling thicker now, muffling the city in a blanket of quiet. The faint glow of the street lamp outside his apartment window lit the worn covers of journals, as though even the world beyond his walls was urging him to open them. He reached for the top notebook, its edges frayed, its spine cracked, and carefully flipped it open. The first pages were dated 1921, written in Eleanor's looping hand. They were filled with observations of daily life, her students, the sharpness of Boston winters, the way she enjoyed lingering in the library on Charles Street. Yet beneath those descriptions lay a current of longing. She wrote of silence that weighs heavier than snow, of a figure who passes me my mind, always walking away, never toward me. Daniel felt the sting of her grief in every line as he moved through the pages. Her words deepened, becoming less about daily happenings and more about her inner world. She wrote about Henry often in those early entries, though never by name. She called him the one who does not return, or the absent light. Daniel could almost feel her writing late at night, her lamp burning low. The city outside hushed while she poured her sorrow into paper. The second notebook began in 1924, 3 years after Henry's death. By then, her tone had shifted. She wrote less about waiting and more about endurance, as if she were forcing herself to move forward. She described attending gatherings with other teachers, trips to the Boston Common in spring, the budding friendships that offer her brief reprieve. Yet in between those notes, she scribbled verses that revealed the truth. The world expects me to walk upright, but my heart bends toward an unseen grave. Daniel lingered over those lines, his chest tightening. Eleanor had carried Henry's absence like a wound stitch beneath her dress, invisible to others but never healed. The third notebook, dated 1930, carried a new name, Charles. She mentioned meeting him at a church event in Cambridge, describing him as steady, dependable, someone whose kindness was quiet but unwavering. She did not write of passion, not of sparks or trembling hands, but calm, of safety. Daniel read her words carefully, sensing that Eleanor had chosen a life with Charles not out of overwhelming love, but out of a desire for shelter. She even admitted in one entry, "He asks little of me except my company. Perhaps that is a blessing. I have no more to give than my presence." By the time he reached the final notebook, spanning the late 1930s, Eleanor's tone had mellowed into something quieter, though still tinged with sorrow. She wrote about her students with fondness, about books she cherished, about the slow rhythm of domestic life in Cambridge. But Henry never vanished from her pages entirely. She mentioned dreams of him, sudden memories, the way certain songs or streets pulled him back to her. One entry struck Daniel so strongly that he read it aloud in a whisper. "I am Mrs. Davenport to the world, but in the deepest chambers of my heart, I remain Eleanor who once waited at the window. There are nights when I wake and reach for a hand that has been gone these 20 years. It is a cruel thing to be alive and haunted by the living you never had." Daniel closed a notebook with trembling hands. The snow outside had thickened, layering the city in silence. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the weight of what he had just uncovered. Eleanor had lived a life outwardly respectable, but inwardly she had carried a private grief until the end. The question of the letter's presence in his Boston apartment returned to him with sharper urgency. Eleanor had lived in Cambridge after her marriage. Why, then, had this letter been left in a building she never inhabited afterward? Unless, perhaps, the apartment had once belonged to Henry. The thought made Daniel sit upright. He had never checked property records for the address where he lived. His obsession had been focused on Eleanor. But what if Henry, before his death, had once lived there? What if the letter was written to him, sent but never delivered, and somehow ended up lost within those walls? The next morning, he made his way to the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds, the marble building echoing with footsteps and faint murmurs. Hours passed as he scoured through property records, cross-referencing addresses and dates. Finally, his hand stilled on a record from 1920. The tenant of his apartment, the very one where he had discovered the letter, had been none other than Henry Alcott. Daniel's breath caught. The pieces slid together with a terrible elegance. Eleanor had written a letter and likely posted it. It had been addressed to Henry's apartment, to the very room Daniel now called his own. But Henry had already been gravely ill by then. Perhaps the letter never reached his hands. Perhaps it had been misplaced in the building, tucked away, swallowed by dust and time until Daniel unearthed it a century later. He left the registry in a daze, walking slowly through the cold streets, the city blurring around him. The truth was almost unbearable. The letter had indeed traveled where it was meant to go, but Henry was gone before he could ever read it. That night, back in his apartment, Daniel sat at the same window Henry might once have looked out of, the same walls that might have echoed with his final breaths. He unfolded the letter once more, the fragile paper glowing faintly in the lamplight. He imagined Eleanor's hand placing it into an envelope, her heart pounding, her hopes soaring, never knowing it would be too late. Tears stung his eyes, unexpected and sharp. He felt not only the tragedy of their story, but also the strange intimacy of it. How he had become the keeper of words that had crossed a century, how his life had now intertwined with theirs. Days passed, but Daniel could not rest. He began to dream of Henry and Eleanor. In one dream, he saw them walking together through Boston Common, their hands brushing but never fully clasping. In another, he saw Eleanor at her window, watching the street below, the gas lamps flickering against her pale face. When he woke, he felt as though he had lived their moments alongside them. Margaret visited again a week later, curious about what Daniel had uncovered in the notebooks. He shared what he had learned, including Henry's connection to his apartment. Her eyes widened with wonder, and she said softly, "It is as if the city itself wanted you to find them, to tell their story." Daniel nodded, though his heart still ached with questions. Why had the letter been sealed in the wall or floorboards rather than delivered properly? Had a landlord misplaced it? Had Charles found it years later and concealed it during renovations? Or had fate itself intervened, ensuring the words remained hidden until the right moment? On a bitterly cold evening, Daniel carried the notebooks and the letter to the Boston Public Library. He spoke to the archivist about preserving them, about making Eleanor's voice part of the city's living memory. The archivist listened with rapt attention, promising to safeguard the documents, to give her words a home where others could hear them. As he left the library, snow swirling around him, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. He had not solved every mystery, but he had brought Eleanor and Henry's story into the light. And yet, something still stirred in him, a sense that the tale was not finished, that there were still threads of connection waiting to be found. Back in his apartment, he lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. Outside, the snow glowed under the lamplight. The city hushed. He sat with the silence, listening, waiting, almost expecting a voice to rise from the walls, a whisper from another century. The flame flickered, casting long shadows, and in that wavering light, Daniel thought he saw the outline of a woman's figure reflected faintly against the glass, watching the street below, just as Eleanor once had. The late afternoon sun in San Francisco slowly sank behind the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange that blended with the silhouettes of old buildings. Rachel stood by the apartment window, gazing outward with thoughts layered upon one another. The long journey she had taken alongside Marcus, Mr. Alvarez, and the new friend she had met had shaped her into someone stronger, someone braver. She was no longer the same woman who had once arrived burdened with fear and broken by sorrow. Now, each step she took felt steadier. Each choice she made bore her courage to face whatever lay ahead. Marcus approached quietly, placing a cup of warm tea on the small table beside her. "You know," he said softly, his eyes holding hers, "we've been through so much together." Rachel allowed a faint smile to appear. "Yes," she answered, "and I believe this isn't the end. Perhaps it's only the beginning of something new." They both fell silent, letting the distant hum of city traffic serve as a backdrop to their thoughts. Far below, streetlights flickered to life one by one, as if the city itself were opening the curtain to its nightly performance. Rachel drew in a deep breath. The pain, the fear, and the secrets that had once chained her were slowly transforming into stepping stones. She knew the road ahead was still long, but she also knew she no longer walked it alone. That night, under a darkening sky, Rachel closed her small notebook, the one filled with fragments of her journey. She wrote the final line before shutting it tight. In every scar I carry, I find strength. In every secret revealed, I find truth. And in every unexpected encounter, I find hope. The room's light dimmed, leaving only the gentle glow of the city that never truly slept. Rachel's life had finally found a new rhythm, not free of challenges, but alive with the certainty that she could endure them. And with that, her long story in San Francisco came to a close. Not an ending to cut everything off, but a reminder that life always offers another chance to begin again,